I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
And those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Dean Detloff, a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto.
And I'm Matt Bernico. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
This week we are going to talk about Paul Virilio, and if you've listened to the podcast for a long time, you will know that we are both kind of big fans of Virilio and also have some problems with him. We've done a couple episodes on him in the past, but he just passed away, and we thought it would be a good opportunity to do a sort of retrospective and think about Virilio's life and kind of work through, I guess, some of like big ideas that he had as a Christian on the left who thought about a bunch of things really, really hard. So I don't know, maybe we should kind of just start out, Matt, by talking a little bit about why you got into Paul Virilio. I think we talked about this in the past, but it's worth bringing up again.
Yeah, for sure. My entrance to Virilio was just in grad school. I didn't have anything to do with him being a Christian, didn't have anything to do with that side of things at all. I was reading a lot about finance capitalism and speed, and my MA advisor said, hey, you should read Paul Virilio. He has a book called Speed and Politics. And I did, and it was not what I was expecting whatsoever. He was way different than the Marxist that I was reading, but it was cool. He was an interesting character and just kind of stuck with me.
Yeah, that's cool. I found him sort of in the opposite way. Nobody at my school told me to read him, but I was just reading a ton of stuff about Christians on the left and came across some interviews with Marilia where he talked about his faith and just got further down the rabbit hole and kind of coincidentally ended up working on things that turned out to be relevant with respect to what Virilio works on in terms of like technology and stuff like that. So now he's like a major figure in my dissertation, but I found him sort of by accident.
Yeah, that's cool. He started becoming a pretty big deal in my classes too. I mean, I guess because you're interested in him and we were like always talking about him, I started like signing him as reading in some of my classes. So we talk about the Bunker Church, and we talk about, a lot of just like the chunks of Really Alive and Crepuscular Dawn and stuff like that in some of my classes, and it's cool. He's a cool guy, and the students love him. The young people love that Paul Virilio.
They sure do. In fact, as we'll see, they love him a lot. He's real popular with the kids, with the youth. Really neat dude. I'm pretty impressed that you assign him to undergraduates, not because undergraduates are dumb, but just because I feel like it would be a challenge to teach Virilio in that context.
Yeah, sometimes. He's a hard person to read, even like as not even an undergrad, right? I mean, he's not the greatest writer in the world. I had a class last year where we read a ton of his stuff about architecture of the oblique and some of his things on architecture and design, and those were really fun too, and actually I think they were like a little more accessible than some of the stuff he wrote about technology, just because they're like so weird and intriguing. Like what if we built like a room and all the floors were crazy slanted?
yeah
Sort of like one of those things that draws you in. You want to know more about that,
right? Well, let's talk a little bit more about him, but before we do, we'll kind of introduce who Virilio was even, because it doesn't matter that we just like him. He also had like a really crazy life, and that helps to contextualize, I think, a lot of the themes that we're going to talk about. So we're going to do a little brief biographical introduction here, and then we're going to talk about 3 themes in his life and work: architecture, speed, and the information bomb. Just to start out, I guess, some basic quick facts, some speedy facts. Paul Virilio was born in 1932, and he died a few weeks ago, September 10th, 2018, which is pretty wild, given that the next day, September 11th, is like pretty significant, just for Virilio's own themes. And also pretty wild because it's 50 years since 1968 this year, which we'll talk about why that matters. But anyway, he was a bunch of things. He held a bunch of titles. He was a philosopher, an urbanist, an architect, academic, an anarchist, a pacifist, and a Christian, and a lot of other things as well, but you get the idea. He also like disavowed most of those titles too. People would say, Virilio as a philosopher, and he'd be like, oh no, I'm not a philosopher. And they'd be like, oh yeah, okay, well, maybe like as an anarchist, and he'd be like, well, I'm an anarchist right now, but like, maybe at that time I would have been something different. So he's very like cautious about labeling himself, but he was a really brilliant and critical thinker who thought a lot about technology and a number of other things. Any other brief introductory notes, Matt, before we talk a little bit about his life?
Nope, sounds good to me. So biography-wise, Virilio was born in Paris and grew up in the north of France. His father was a communist and his mother was a Catholic, sort of the meeting of our two worlds as well. It's good. World War II and the Nazi occupation of France had a huge impact on his life and the way he developed politically and as an architect and in basically every way. I think that like bombings and bunkers are so like key to his work. It is not hard to see how this impacted him. Not only did he live through the Blitzkrieg of Nantes, but also through the Allied bombing as well. So he had the worst of it all.
Yeah, literally everyone trying to kill him.
Right. Virilio is even famously quoted saying, "The war was my university." That's an idea that he'll come back to kind of throughout his life in some different ways as well.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy in a lot of reflections that he gives in interviews and things like that. He'll talk about being a child in the midst of war, and that is really, I don't know, troubling. You kind of see like his whole life is I think set on trying to make sense of that and like working through that sort of shared trauma. Just really, really intense. But what's fascinating is he ends up like mining those experiences for so many theoretical tools later on. After the war ended, the Second World War, in 1950, he converted to Catholicism. He was 18 years old. And he says this about his conversion in an interview: "I converted in the company of worker priests. Worker priests are, in France, those priests who take an industrial job and go to live with the factory workers. They do not display their pastoral cross. I chose to convert with a worker priest because I wanted something real, not some religious show with a guy in a costume." So that's the tone of his Catholicism as a young person, and I think it's pretty fair to say that that characterizes the rest of his religious sensibilities and also his philosophical sensibilities. He's kind of always pressing for what's real, like behind the costumes, not just of religion, but even of like the societies in front of us. Even things that sort of look placid or peaceful, he'll often poke a little bit further and try to find the kind of troubling real things underneath them.
Yeah, that's a pretty good observation. Disappearance is a huge idea in his work. The disappearance of illusion and dissimulation and those kinds of things. So yeah, good observation.
Thanks. I just made it up.
Thank you. Good. Thank you. Really. After that time, after the war, Virilio started sort of his inroad to architecture, but he kind of got there in sort of a weird roundabout way. Virilio was never trained as an architect, but he ended up teaching it in a bunch of places around Europe, so that's pretty cool. But he did have like a lot of ideas about space, and I think a lot of those again stem from his experience in the war. But we can come back around to that. He did get trained as an artist, so not as an architect, but as an artist. He was someone who made stained glass in cathedrals. It's even another sort of cool art historical note that he worked with Matisse, which is, pretty cool. Matisse is a neat dude. Go to a museum, see his paintings. They're great. He only ever designed one building that actually got built, and that is a thing that we've talked about on this podcast before because it's so absolutely cool. That is what we refer to as the Bunker Church in Nevers, France. He worked on the Bunker Church with an architect friend for a little bit and then enemy for a lot of bit, Claude Parent. The two of them had a bunch of ideas about space and what they called the function of the oblique in architecture. And basically, the function of the oblique is kind of like making floors that slope and slant and playing with space with those types of lines. Virilio ended up being a teacher because of his participation in the 1968 rebellion in Paris. That's a big deal in his life, too. I think that's when he kind of really becomes an anarchist. Basically, like, he was squatting a theater with a bunch of students, and he would give impromptu lectures on space. And after things calmed down, the students nominated him to be an architectural professor, where he just, like, kept working out some of those theories. That's the best way to become a professor, actually. That's a good situation.
Yeah, it really is. Let's talk about that for a minute. Like, I guess some of those themes that come out in that architectural moment or period for him, like the function of the oblique. I mean, you mentioned it earlier. All these slopey, slanty floors. I love it because it's like deceptively simple. Like the premise is, hey, we always build these buildings with straight lines, vertical lines, and horizontal lines, floors and walls. But what if some were diagonal? And that's like the crazy idea. And it's so funny because in certain interviews, people will say, okay, but what about, like furniture? How would you sit down and have dinner with somebody at a table? And he's just like, yeah, I don't know, just like pull it out of the floor, like put a table on the floor. And sometimes you could like pull it out if you want. It's like just so silly, but also really, really fun. Like the idea is that people should think creatively about how to move around. And if they did that, it would maybe change the way that people think.
Yeah, totally. And it's really fun, too, to see how some of that early work with Architecture Principi and Claude Parent like has a really like interesting not only like architectural style, but how he adopts it to really be a reflection of his faith and the way that he thinks that spaces of worship should work, too.
Yeah.
The Bunker Church is absolutely like such an interesting thing because from the outside, it looks like a giant... Okay, all my students say it looks like a hungry hippo because it looks like it's kind of like this weird rounded shape at the front. It looks like the front of like a hungry hippo nose. But if you look down at it from the top, it's sort of like the shape of an anatomically correct heart, and it has all these like subdivisions and divisions about like where you're supposed to sit and how you move through the the space of worship to receive Eucharist and where the confession booth is and stuff. So these really interesting ideas. It's also cool too because it's like if you go to church. You always know where the front is because there's like an elevated place, but in the Bunker Church there's like two sort of sloping elevated places. There's some ideas about like equality and sort of like who's the highest up in the room and stuff like that get messed around with too.
Yeah, there's a real theological move in that, I think. I was doing a little bit more research on the Bunker Church just recently, just after Virilio passed away, trying to, I guess, brush up on some of that stuff that I like so much. And I didn't know this before, but I guess there was a bishop in Nevers where they built the church. And the way the church got built is he held this open competition, and they were just accepting submissions, and Virilio submitted this one with Claude Parent. And so the bishop... he was into like Vatican II, which was in the air at the time. This is the early 60s. And he ended up accepting their proposal, in part, I think, to stir up controversy. Like, that's how Virilio tells the story anyway, that the bishop was like, yeah, some people kind of want a different church, but yours makes everyone upset, and that's the one I want. But I think that, like, theologically, there are actually some cool things happening that resonate with Vatican II. Like, it's not just a sort of, like, hey, here's a crazy creative approach to church building. For example, like after Vatican II, the priest in Catholic Mass turns to face the congregation instead of facing the wall. And in the Bunker Church, the fact that there are two sloping floors that kind of slope into each other is really important, just for that sort of liturgical change, because the feeling that you get is that the priest is sort of falling in toward the congregation and they're sort of falling in toward the priest. Like there's this real destabilization of the hierarchical role of the priest in Catholicism, which is like pretty radical. Like it's not just a weird building; it's actually like a really weird idea, and one that people were trying to figure out how to deal with in the Catholic Church at that time. So seeing Virilio kind of soak in all these different themes and like make them his own, and then like spit them back out in a structure like this is pretty fascinating. I was talking with some friends who had been to the Bunker Church just this past week. And they were telling me it's crazy because from the outside it looks so austere. It's like this big slab of concrete. But when you get inside, it actually feels very like warm and kind of homey, even though it's still concrete. Like there's this warmth to it that doesn't get taken away by just the sheer material of it. And I think there's something about that also just feels like very Virilio to me.
Yeah, totally. This is okay. I think this is something that is true about Virilio, but you'll have to tell me whether it is or not, because I know it's something that you have written about. So the thing too about the function of the oblique is it's like kind of like miming what happens like after a bunker is struck by like a bomb, in the sense that like the floors get like, you know, bent in or like sloped in a certain direction where there's like a huge crack. And so that's true. Yes. Yeah,
that is true. And also, the slopes are intentionally put into certain bunkers with the idea that if a bomb hit it, it would actually like explode in a certain direction, and that like messes up the floors and ceilings.
Right. Cool. Well, I guess that's really an interesting thing then to like put into a church, because it tells you a little bit about like, you know, like what the function of the church is. In some ways, it's like sort of shielding you from a blow or something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And I mean, Virilio says also that he felt that if he was going to design a church in the middle of the Cold War, it would have to be something like this. It would have to sort of speak to like the threat of mutually assured destruction in a real, authentic way. And I think there's something about that is important too. That there's a political statement involved in this. There's a religious statement involved in it. It's really kind of the Bunker Church. I mean, this is like a hobby horse of mine, but I just feel like it's a good summary of Virilio. It's like everything that Virilio ever was or you know did or thought about is all there in the Bunker Church.
Yeah, I think that's really true. On that point of mutually shared destruction and sort of like the apocalyptic kind of feel you get from that idea of like, you know, the church as bunker kind of shielding you from the outside. There's a particular type of apocalypticism that I think we can label Virilio with, and it's a really Christian type of apocalypticism. Here's a really cool quote that's from Gray Ecology, which is kind of like a record of a class that he taught at the European Graduate School. He says this: when someone tells me you're a revolutionary, I say no, I'm a revelationary. And yes, I believe this profoundly. I'm not apocalyptic. I repeat, the end of the world is a concept without a future. There's no interest in the end of the world. One boom and there's nothing left. That is of no interest to an intellectual or a thinker. The end of the world is lame. I love this so much because it's like, well, the Baudrillard's apocalypticism is like not about the end of humanity, because like that one's kind of already promised to you in some way, and like who cares? Like once it's over, it's like over. But the end of the world that he's more interested in, or I guess the one that's more concerning to him, is the one that will survive through. And there's like a really type of like a type of pessimism that is, I don't know, maybe pessimism isn't the right word, but there's a type of pessimism in his writing that is like extremely sober about that type of apocalyptic event, the one that will live through, the one that will be shielded from, but will happen nonetheless.
Yeah, for sure. That's probably the craziest thing about Virilio, is that if you just read his books, I don't think you would come away actually really understanding that sort of like mustard seed of faith or whatever. But he's very honest about it in personal interviews and in his own life. And yeah, like that idea that the apocalypse that he wants to avoid is the one that says that there's just an end and that's all. And there's something like equal parts like hopeful, but also troubling about the idea that humans would survive the kind of apocalypse that Virilio investigates, or the kind of end that Virilio like worries about. It's like, I don't know, like sort of like Mad Max style, like possible futures. But Virilio is really intentional, I think, about saying, well, there are other ways that humans could be. And I mean, it would be really hard to get there, but like there's no ultimate reason that we can't. Like there's that kind of unerasable like hope against hope that you find in Virilio.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, maybe we could start talking a little bit more about his like analytics of how the world works and why he might be afraid of certain kinds of apocalypse or trying to like warn us away from them. He wrote a pretty famous book called Speed and Politics. I think that's probably his most famous book. It's short, but he tries to give an overview of a new approach to political thought, one that looks at like movement as a political problem. So like who gets to move and how do they move and why do they move? All those kinds of questions. And it's also interesting as an intervention into like French politics because he's sort of into like the situationist movement. You know, they're the ones who are famous for saying like you should just wander around if you want to be a good revolutionary. But he's also like kind of not in that movement. He has a sort of distinct position. So he has his toes in revolutionary politics, but he's a bit nervous about them too. And the book isn't really systematic, but it does try to present some themes and conceptual tools to interpret the world. I said it's short, but it like takes a very long time to read, I think, because it's like packed with a lot of like suggestive sentences. But yeah, maybe we could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, totally. I think you're right to note that it is a short book in page, but not in like how long it will take you to read. It's got some hard ideas, but it's cool. It's a neat book that like uncovers sort of like the ways that movement is so political. Like it opens up, if I recall, with like discussions of like protesters in the street versus like fascists in the street and like who controls them. Right, and like how that type of movement, who can pass through places, ends up being really political.
Right. Here's a quote just from that beginning. I think this is like the first or second page, actually. He says, "The revolutionary contingent attains its ideal form not in the place of production, but in the street, where for a moment it stops being a cog in the technical machine and itself becomes a motor, a machine of attack. In other words, a producer of speed." There's a lot of interesting things about this quote. I think if you're like a good Marxist, you'll note that he's like definitely throwing some not so subtle jabs in the Marxist direction, right? That like the revolutionary contingent, it takes its ideal form not in the place of production, right? Like not strictly as a sort of like identity of being a worker per se, but in the street where people can sort of move freely and experiment with like what it would mean to kind of break out of the confines of like who lets you move and where. So yeah, I don't know. Anything that really gets you going about that sort of idea, Matt, even though it's not a Marxism TM concept?
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, I think there's a lot in Speed and Politics, but I guess what makes the point really stick to me in terms of like how dromology, which is the word that Virilio uses to talk about this like analysis of speed, is in a really short essay he wrote. So this is like another reference yet to add to your pile of books to read or whatever. So he wrote an essay. It's really like it's more geared towards urbanism and city design, which is something I was into for a really short second last year. Anyways, but it's called The Overexposed City.
Oh yeah.
So he's talking about the ways that that traffic passes through cities, and like sort of his prediction is the way that cities basically become airports, and they're like, you know, less about streets and trains, but more about like the way that you land in them and then you fly right back out of them.
Right.
So this idea about like the way dromology is about the ways that things pass traffic through them, and that's a pretty wild idea if you start thinking about it, because I mean, he's not exactly wrong, especially considering like the Midwest United States. We got a lot of airports out here, a lot of hubs, and if you look at like the designs of cities, they are completely designed to pass traffic through them from like city to airport. If you ever fly in St. Louis, you will see how true this is. Like the public transit in St. Louis leaves a lot to be desired. The train goes to one really important place, and that place is the airport.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It's crazy too, because I think this idea of like being aware of how people move around is really useful, both analytically, but also just practically. Like at a protest I was at, I don't know, sometime I forget even which one it was, not too long ago. I was walking with some friends, and it was one of these protests where there's like a planned route, and you walk from like this location to another location, and we're just chatting, to pass the time, I guess. And my one friend was saying, well, how radical do you think a protest like this is? And I thought of Virilio because when this friend of mine asked, we were turning the corner at a street light, and there were police officers who had like cordoned off, 2 streets so that cars couldn't go through, but that also that we could go through. And I was like, well, I mean, if it was a really kind of like revolutionary situation, you wouldn't really like be looking to the cops or the streetlight to tell you like where you should go or what direction your mass should be moving in. Those wouldn't be like the 2 kinds of authorities that like direct or regulate like the traffic. And that's not to say that like every planned, march or something is pointless or anything, not by any stretch. But it just kind of helps you, I guess, be alive to the idea that, if the police aren't really threatened by like where you're moving, that's at least like something to kind of, contemplate like while you're doing that walk. There's a sort of there's a ruling logic at work that still even tries to contain the dissent.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation to draw out. Well, on that point, riffing off of that whole idea you just said, here's like a paper idea out here for all you grad students listening, because you all are probably. So like the Black Lives Matter protests are all like, well, not all, but at least how they represented themselves in St. Louis area are extremely democratic, in the sense that like they consisted largely of people blocking interstates. So I mean, kind of like going off what you're saying, right? Like a really revolutionary movement, you wouldn't be looking for the direction of the cops, and I think that the Black Lives Matter protests in Ferguson, the Ferguson uprising, and even in Baltimore too, where people are like literally blocking off streets and like clogging up traffic, is a really kind of Virilioian tactic, in the sense that it's like a real nomadic, like mass of people moving into the street and stopping traffic altogether.
Yeah, for sure.
If you control the streets, you kind of control power for a hot second, and I think that's cool.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. There's a movement in Canada called Idle No More, which is an indigenous protest movement, and it's the same kind of thing. Like, so at first, it's really fascinating because they would have protests in shopping malls, and they would do these like round dances there. And that was a big deal because shopping malls are weird places full of mobility and a lot of politics and movement, like organized movement. But then that sort of scaled up very, very quickly to shutting down transitways, like roadways, but also like trains and like places where people make deliveries and stuff like that. And it is like the most Virilio thing I've ever seen, I think, because basically what happened is they started asking questions of like, well, how would you really shut something down if you couldn't convince like a ton of people to strike or something like that? And it would be like, well, you would shut down like transportation, right? Like you would make it so that maybe you can't like force the workers not to go to work or something, but you can definitely make sure that like production slows down. And it's that slowing down, like the politics of time involved in that just really struck me, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. This is also, maybe this is like a little bit embarrassing. But during my master's program, I got accepted to this one conference. It was like a Christian philosophy conference. And I did write, I wrote about like, this is actually such a stupid idea looking back on it. But I guess I'll share it to all of our fans on this podcast. I was thinking about the ways like work stoppage is like it's such a hard thing for like Christians to get their brains around. Like, striking is like an idea that's really hard to convince Christians of because of right-wing tendencies and ideology in the United States. And I was thinking about the ways that like it was cool with my boss at the time if I came to work a little bit late because I went to morning prayer at church. So I wrote this paper about how, like, I don't know, if you think about it, like prayer is cool because it's like doing nothing. It's like a stoppage in your day, and that's something to think about in the face of capitalism. And it's like a silly idea, I think, still, but it is cool. I like the idea of, I mean, prayer in Christianity is always supposed to be something so big, and like you gotta pray and you're asking God for things, but also like, wouldn't it be cool if like the answer to our prayers was just like showing up and doing nothing and not working? That'd be some pretty sick stuff. I like that a lot. Yeah,
no, I think there's something there though. I mean, it's obviously like not a complete revolutionary solution or anything like that. But there's something to that. Like even those small sort of like micro politics of time, they make a difference, and they like make you aware of certain things. I mean, there are like countries that are more thickly Christian in the world where like all work does stop on like certain holidays, and not that like I think that's a really super great idea or anything. You know, having like super thick religious cultures have a lot of dangers to them too, but there's something to that, right? That like it's pretty crazy to think of something like prayer being like meaningful enough to maybe slow down production for a minute.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I don't know.
So,
it's a cool idea.
If you work at Chick-fil-A out there, just be like, hey, sorry, I'm going to be like 30 minutes late, and just go to church.
Yeah, that's right. Nice. Well, let's add one more piece to this equation here, because the connection between speed and politics also helps Virilio think about the militarization of society, and that's like a huge theme that connects back to what we were just talking about earlier. So, for example, like it's not just like politicians or specific police officers who decide who gets to move or how. It's also weapons and defenses. So something as simple as like building a fortress or inventing like gunpowder. Those are the kinds of things that Virilio really keys in on. Like, what does it mean to sort of have a fortified walled city in a way that, might not have existed at this or that point in history. And so like as history progresses to this point of being able to like totally annihilate the planet with nuclear weapons, Virilio says we enter a time of dromocracy, where we're like ruled according to these regulated speeds through kind of like an implicit militarization that's underneath society. So we talked about this a long time ago with the war and cinema stuff, but I think it's worth bringing up again here. There's this kind of like irreducible connection between the rise of like the state and military technologies and speed, and that's like another dig at like Leninism and the communism of his dad, I guess. That like there's some real problems for Virilio with any kind of state solution because the state is tied to these kind of military histories. I'll let you jump in a sec, but I want to read this quote from Deleuze and Guattari in 1,000 Plateaus, because it's actually like surprisingly good as a summary, which is not often what I find in Deleuze and Guattari, but it works here. So surprisingly clarifying, they write, "It is yet another contribution of Paul Virilio to have stressed this weapon-speed complementarity. The weapon invents speed, or the discovery of speed invents the weapon. The projective character of weapons is the result. The war machine, which is the state, releases a vector of speed so specific to it that it needs a special name. It is not only the power of destruction, but dromocracy." I think that's like a really important piece of it, that like the habits, the social habits that get produced out of the connections between speed and the military aren't just like now people can destroy stuff. It's actually like now people can actually regulate stuff. There's like a positive, like troublingly positive side to that.
Yeah, that is a really cool insight on technology, I think, and one that gets drummed up in media studies all the time. Like Friedrich Kittler, I don't know if you're familiar with him. It doesn't matter. He's like a media historian. He always notes that like technology is always just the misuse of military technology, like cultural technology, like TV, cinema, etc. is always just like the misuse of military technology. And I mean that's an idea he definitely borrows from Virilio because they were contemporaries. And to me, it's such a troubling idea. Actually, it's like actually really messes me up a lot. I mean, it really like I guess even media studies people like McLuhan even get this too, right? Where people have these weird understandings of technology where they're actually completely neutral tools that have like just like no logic to them except the reason that people might use them. It's kind of like the guns don't kill people, people kill people kind of thing. But like, I guess what Virilio tells us in, the ways that Deleuze and Guattari sum it up here is that there's something specific about the there's something specific about the state, and there's something specific about the, not just the power of destruction that like the state can bring, but also its dromocracy, its own logic of speed, and its own sort of like, like the other word they use, projective character of weapons. It's so troubling because like, here's like a sort of a fundamental Christian idea is like is beating our swords into plowshares, right? Like the repurposing of our military technologies towards like technologies of culture, which is hard because like, you know, you can't have those technologies of culture apparently without the state, without that power of destruction and democracy.
Right. That is crazy. Someone should write a paper about that. A lot of free paper ideas here.
This is all the paper ideas. Yeah.
I think that is actually cool too, because there's a real like anarchist impulse to that. In a way that I think is actually genuinely really useful. Like it's really complex, and it's trying to figure out like both the negative and positive sort of uses of power or capacities of power. I mean, Foucault does this a lot too, I think, in a way that's comparable. It's like, instead of saying you should just renounce certain things, it's like, well, these are all the things that we kind of have right now, and we have to figure out how to deal with them. Like, you can't just renounce them. I think, well, okay, we should transition to the information bomb, or we're going to talk too much about this. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about that relationship between anarchism and Marxism and Virilio. So here's a fun quote that I think is just a really, like, nice side-eye at Marx and Engels. So he writes, Virilio writes, "In fact, history progresses at the speed of its weapon systems." And that I think is a not so subtle sort of corrective, Virilio thinks, to the Marxist idea that history progresses according to class struggle, right? Like all history is the history of class struggle. So for Virilio, like, there's something underneath that class struggle. There's a logistics that is playing itself out regardless of classes. And Virilio isn't, it's not like class analysis doesn't matter to him. It matters a lot. But for him, like the bourgeoisie, for example, the thing that he thinks that Marx and Engels always forget is that though Marx talks about enclosures, for example, in like England, how some space gets taken over and sold or bought by landowners and landlords. Really wants to say, but those enclosures also have a lot to do with movement and who gets to go where, and that's something that the bourgeoisie gets to do. They get to sort of make these decisions about like how circulation happens. Any thoughts about that, Matt, as a person who sort of thinks about these intersections between Marxism and anarchism? I guess maybe both, like, what do you think Virilio maybe offers to Marxists as a useful tool, and maybe what do you think that Marxists might have what kind of objections might they have?
Virilio definitely does sort of like question the more scientific aspects of like Marxism, I suppose. Like, for Marx, like the very first fact of human history is about like, how production happens. But I think what Virilio offers those Marxists is like, well, production has to happen through movement. I mean, it's like you have to get to work somehow, or like you have to figure out how you're going to negotiate like farmland and like the city or something, right? Like how like do you have like a road running through your own property? Does the city put it there? If it's like more expedient, do they get to say like, sorry, this is our land now, we're going to expropriate and close upon it and like take it from you because like it benefits us, right? I think it's just like, I think it gives Marxists like another sort of angle to think about material history. It's not like Virilio is talking about something that's immaterial or idealistic. I think he's just talking about a different sort of I don't know, I'll use a really Virillian word here, like a different vector of history, right, or something. Like it's a different angle. It's looking at the whole situation, not in terms of production, but instead movement. And I think that is pretty valuable just the same. I mean, Virilio himself does not make sort of like a systematic immortal science from his own thoughts, I suppose. But like, I think incorporating Virilio's thought into Marxist theory, or even into like more anarchist like sort of analysis of the state, is completely doable and easy. You can do it with no problem.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And that's what I've found so useful about Virilio too, that like he'll talk about a political economy of speed. He wants to sort of add those qualifiers to like Marxist analysis. And like it's not the worst idea to do that, like to have a political economy of speed. I mean, I think sometimes that Virilio does sort of like in his attempt to combat like an economic determinism, he ends up with this weird kind of like dromological determinism that I think is not very like satisfactory as an alternative, but it's like a really helpful synthesis anyway, if you can pull it off.
Yeah, and I think some of that too is just like Virilio's own like overstating of things in interviews. Like that's kind of part of his rhetoric is to go big every single time.
Right.
Extreme Virilio.
Extreme Virilio. That's right.
Cool. So maybe we should talk about for like one hot second sort of the kind of okay, so I mean, speed in politics, like movement is a really political idea for sure. But there's another big problem with speed, not just like who can go where, but also that speed necessarily brings what he will call like a science of accidents. You definitely have heard us say in other episodes of the Magnificast that the invention of the ship is the invention of the shipwreck. And that is a very good Virilio quote that you can throw at people at all times of the day, especially STEM majors. Tell them that and they will be astonished by your teachings. So, Dean, do you want to tell us a little bit about the integral accident and what that has to do with speed?
Let's get into it because accidents are like my favorite thing. I've got so much to say about accidents in my dissertation, which I just finished proposing. All right. The invention of the ship is also the invention of the shipwreck. What Virilio means by that is that all technologies, when people invent them, they don't necessarily invent them expecting a catastrophe, but they will necessarily have their own kind of catastrophe. And Virilio says those accidents, those catastrophes, reveal something substantial about that technology. So, like, shipwrecks belong to ships. You can't have a shipwreck without a ship. You can have all kinds of other disasters, but there's something unique about shipwrecks that involve ships wrecking in particular. And as the world sort of gets faster and faster, Virilio says, not only with like transportation technologies, like we can literally move faster, but also increasingly with information technologies where we can like move information around the world like faster than like the speed of light almost. Like that ends up creating all kinds of opportunities for accidents that we still haven't quite seen. So if you think of something like the Titanic, right? The Titanic is like a really sort of spectacular event. Like it's a spectacle. The Titanic crashes, and then, it's the ship that is supposed to be unsinkable. Well, that's a huge disaster. But imagine if like the internet broke, like for real, actually broke. Like if Y2K really happened, like people wouldn't have been wrong to have been like building bunkers and stocking up on like supplies if that was like really the case, right? And so that's what Virilio is trying to sort of articulate in some of his later work, I think, is that as the world speeds up, as faster and faster accidents are made possible, we're sort of faced with the possibility of what he will call the information bomb. Kind of like the nuclear bomb was like the violent conclusion of like the physical sciences. A speculative information bomb would be the violent conclusion of like the communications technologies.
Okay. Here's a good quote. Maybe we can start off with and kind of riff off of, I guess, in a hot second. So Virilio says that at the Birmingham Summit of May 1998, that's sort of the time period this is all kind of taking place in before the new millennium. At the Birmingham Summit of May 1998, the Central Intelligence Agency not only takes seriously the possibility of a widespread computer catastrophe in the year 2000, but that it has scheduled this hypothetical event into its calendar, indicating on a state-by-state basis how far individual nations will have to go to forearm themselves against it. So this is the kind of thing that Virilio's thinking of so he kind of starts off the book talking about the ways that the world is becoming globalized and sort of like enclosed upon digitally. Cybernetically is the word that he ends up using a lot, but it's kind of like an old-timey word that people don't often use anymore. Anyways, but the way that the world is becoming sort of enclosed upon digitally by forces that are yes, like neoliberal in terms of like banking and stuff like that, and definitely, and like thoroughly capitalist. So the world's become enclosed upon by like a capitalism that is way faster than any other capitalism that's ever been. And then, but like at the same time, like, I mean, that sucks. Like, that's bad. At the same time, if that capitalism that's way faster than any other type of capitalism, if it just stopped working, it would be like catastrophic, right? That would be something that it would be very difficult to sort of like deal with. And I think it is actually so funny because like I remember being alive in the year 2000, and I remember the people that thought that like it was going to be the end of the world, and like I don't know, I thought they were crazy because like it's not going to be that big of a deal. People just fix that computer problem. But it is interesting that he says like the CIA was like taking it pretty seriously. Like they were worried about it for a hot second. So like, all right, I mean, someone's got to be planning all of those weird contingencies.
Yeah, I had an uncle who probably is still drinking water bottles that he bought for Y2K. So not just the CIA.
Yeah, right. Your uncle had it covered too.
Yeah, my uncle was on a state-by-state basis thinking about it. To this day, the joke is still, if anything ever bad happens in the world, you should just like go to my uncle's house. He'll like know what to do.
Everybody, we'll all go there. We'll all meet up there.
Yeah, you've got to. He's got a lot of water. Yeah, I think though it's fascinating because Virilio is constantly trying to pop the bubble of technological optimism or progress. So you still hear today so many like technological wonks or whatever, like Silicon Valley types talking about how the digital revolution and computerization of society is just gonna like keep improving, and keep like making everybody's lives like more convenient. And Alexa can like turn all your lights on for you, I guess, without you having to get out of bed or something. But Virilio is always like, yeah, but like, what else could Alexa do though? That's kind of his impulse all the time is to say like, we don't even know what Alexa could do to your home yet.
Yeah, and I think that's man, it's such actually like a good forewarning. So the book Speed and Politics, a really cool designer kind of guy named Benjamin Bratton wrote the introduction. He's great. Check out Benjamin Bratton. Really recently, he wrote a book that is like extremely Virilio inspired. That's extremely Virilio inspired. Called The Stack, and I think it's really worth everyone's time. It's kind of terrifying. Well, anyways, the whole thesis of the book is basically exactly what Virilio is saying here, is that like technology and like digital technology is not infallible. It's like not bulletproof, right? There must be an accident kind of within it that we either haven't seen yet or have seen and just kind of learned how to deal with. But I think what Bratton makes so clear in his book about technology is that like the ways that all of our digital systems are not like one sort of monolithic sort of thing, but are themselves like interlocking systems of government agencies and corporate interests and banks and all kinds of other things too, right? And that there's just like, there's too many layers of the stack to really know like what is actually going on in any sort of complete way. So it's like the sort of like digital technological layer ends up being a type of metaphysics in our lives that we cannot see the corners of even. Like it's so all-encompassing that we don't really even know all the ways that things connect, and this will end up causing us problems. And
yeah,
yes, he is not wrong.
Yeah, I think this is a really good way to even link back to what we were talking about at the very beginning with his conversion to Catholicism, right? That refusal of costumes, like wanting something real. That's the kind of thing that Virilio is trying to point to, I think, even at the end of his life, that underneath all these things, like when you log onto your Facebook or whatever, you kind of have a naive understanding that like maybe Facebook is like mining your data or whatever, and like as of at least like a year or two ago, like there's no way that if you're a sort of moderately informed person that you could deny that was happening, right? Like everybody knows that. But even knowing that, underneath all of that, there's like still more. Like that's kind of Virilio's point, is that like what you know in terms of like journalism is only so far of what you know. There's all kinds of stuff that you don't know, like still underneath that. And if you have a I guess not like an expectation of the worst, but like an understanding that history has these kinds of accidents built in. You might be able not to like be afraid of like using technologies as something per se, but you might be able to like try to enter into it with a little more like self-criticism and like how not only how you use these technologies, but like how they use you in certain ways, and to like not be surprised when like sometimes you're going to get screwed by them.
That's like sometimes being screwed by them is such like a light way to put it.
Yeah. Like the end of he has this book called Open Sky, which is about like surveillance.
Right.
And man, if you get to the end of Open Sky and you like still want to like go outside, you have a very strong power of optimism.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, here's another cool quote that we can pull out and talk through a little bit too from that book, The Information Bomb. Okay, so he has a lot to say in that book about science and the ways that science kind of functions as a discourse within popular culture, and I actually think it's really good in a lot of ways. So he says this is really towards the beginning of the book, in case you're following along for some weird reason. He says, "As everyone knows, that which is excessive is insignificant. Science without conscience is a mere ruination of the soul. And a technoscience without a consciousness of its impending end is, however, unwittingly merely a sport." So then he goes on to describe extreme sports, which is a weird turn. He says, "Extreme sports, those in which one deliberately risks one's own life on the pretext of achieving a record performance. Extreme science, the science which runs the incalculable risk of the disappearance of all science." I think this quote kind of speaks to the popular discourse of like science and technology, especially with regards to Silicon Valley, where we think that we can solve kind of all of the world's problems with like a new app or something, when we're not even like really getting something that is scientifically relevant or helpful. We're just like getting sort of the representation of science. And that's kind of where he goes into like following these two quotes, is that like science becomes more about like the presentation of a discovery or a presentation of like a new piece of technology, but not really about science in the sense that it makes anyone's life any better. It's like science. It is, you know, science without a conscience. I mean, all of that being said, we can talk about that more, but like, is Virilio watching the X Games? Is he like, is Virilio out there? Like he's got Dave Mirra, the Dave Mirra game for his PS2 or something. Like,
yeah,
where does he learn about extreme sports? Who taught him that?
Jeff Bezos is like the new Tony Hawk, basically. Yeah, I think there's something to that, though. I mean, I think of someone like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or whatever. Whenever I hear that Virilio line about turning science into a sport, because you do get the impression that like inventing a Tesla car is like kind of just Elon Musk's way of trying to like break a record or something. Like that's the feeling that it sometimes feels. Or like Bezos is like trying to go to space, right, for like literally no reason except that he has like too much money, I guess. And that, you know, for Virilio, he talks about that as sort of the risk of the disappearance of all science. And I think what I like about that is like, so Virilio is nervous about science, but he's not really anti-science per se. He actually like kind of wants certain scientists to, you know, like the ethical ones, to really have a voice. Like he's always talking about the scientists that invented the nuclear bomb, and I mean, he thinks that was a huge mistake, obviously. But like every once in a while he'll reference how like a lot of them either like committed suicide or became like kind of humanitarian voices talking about like how it was wrong, like what they did was wrong and they needed to like repent of it and sort of confess it as a sin. And I think that's the kind of thing that Virilio is trying to like remind people, that like science isn't just about getting to space or like having an electric car, but it's also about like recognizing the kind of power that you really do kind of wield.
Yeah. I think Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, but definitely Jeff Bezos, I mean, they're both bad, but like maybe those two are like the perfect sort of Virilio supervillains, in the sense that they're both really interested in like the development of transportation. I mean, Elon Musk in terms of like electric car, Jeff Bezos in like really efficient routes to like get his, to get Amazon Prime delivered or something, but also in their like extreme interest in going to outer space. Virilio has this really interesting take too in Gray Ecology, and probably in like 3 different of his books too. He like says the same thing sometimes, but there's a part, at least in Gray Ecology, where he says like once we start looking to like inhabit a different planet, like the Earth is already kind of like lost to us, in the sense that like as soon as we think that we can get off of this sort of like this very limited piece of space and travel somewhere else, then like we will no longer understand the Earth as important whatsoever, and it's kind of like over ecologically for us. And I don't know, man, like he's like, that's right. Like, I don't know, there's a really huge bummer, I guess, that I felt this week existentially in my soul, where it was just like there was like a press release from like the White House people, whoever are in charge of like climate problems. I don't remember especially like who it was, which is bad. I guess I probably could have like prepared for this podcast and like figured it out, but I didn't. Anyways, it was just basically saying that like by 2100 that like the Earth's climate would increase by 7 degrees, and that like the response from the White House was like, I don't know, changing like emissions of cars like wouldn't help us, so what are we gonna do? It's like, you know, just like kind of like let that slow burn happen. So it's like, I don't know, people are already sort of looking towards like inhabiting other planets, or like going into space or doing whatever. And like, and then like I saw this other sort of press release about the inevitability of climate change, and it's just like all hitting me at once. And this like supreme Virilio movement of Jeff Bezos being the most evil person in the world, and then the United States like not really caring about climate.
Yeah.
So Virilio's right. That's all I'm trying to say. He's right, and it sucks.
It's true. Yeah, super true. He has a line in The Art of the Motor where he talks about the Earth becoming humanity's phantom limb, which is like a really haunting way of putting it.
Yeah, that's in The Information Bomb too.
Right. Maybe that's what it is. I thought it was in The Art of the Motor. I guess you could say it twice. Who knows?
I mean, he does say a lot of things twice. And good. We need to hear it 1,000 more times, probably.
All right. Well, I think like as we kind of get to the top of the hour here, we can sort of pull some of these threads together and think about what Virilio passing from this world means for us today. We talked before on the podcast when we've talked about Virilio, saying that to say something like Marx was right is like a really different thing than saying Virilio was right. Like saying Marx is right is the kind of thing that you say if you want to have some hope. That, I mean, maybe it's too bad that he's right about how horrible capitalism is, but at the end of the day, like, he gives you something to do. But to say that Virilio is right is like a lot more troubling and challenging. And I think that as we kind of reflect on losing Virilio as a critical voice, at least a contemporaneous critical voice, it's probably important to kind of let that fact that he is right about so many things continue to sort of trouble us. Maybe with that same apocalyptic or like resistance to apocalyptic thinking that Virilio himself has, you know, where like, yeah, maybe you could have some hope. Maybe you could find other ways of circulating or moving around. But nevertheless, being willing to stay with the fact that he's right about these really kind of massive problems. I sort of feel at least like that's the only way that you could ever get somewhere else, is by like owning up to how bad it really is in a certain sense.
Yeah, I think that's right. It is a bummer to say that Virilio's right, because so much of what he's right about is just like how completely screwed people are. I mean, just like, I mean, as a human, like, it's just like, it's like a sense that like, no matter what we do, there's always the sense that the accident is kind of coming, and there's really nothing you can do about it because it's the nature of technology. So just gotta stick with the trouble, I suppose. Yeah,
I think so. But I guess if you're Virilio, you would also go to church. So who knows?
That's the optimistic point, though. Is like, technology is bad, but like, I don't know, the eschaton, huh?
Yeah, I mean, just build your church to look like a bunker, I guess.
Duh. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard in this episode, that's messed up because this episode's kind of depressing if you think about it. If you like what you heard in this episode, you should go read Speed and Politics, Gray Ecology, The Administration of Fear, The Aesthetics of Disappearance, War and Cinema, all those good Virilio books. Get them on Semiotext or wherever. Download them. PDFs. Also, you could give us money on Patreon. That's really cool. All your support that you've given to us over the past year or so on Patreon has been really awesome and definitely helped us do new things like make t-shirts and make stickers and make some cool pins that have been sent out to people, and make sure you tweet a picture of yourself with one. It's pretty cool.
We got one already. Somebody put it on his hat. Looks pretty good.
Oh yeah, looks great. Great hat, great pin. The intro music to this podcast is by Amari Armstrong, and the outro music is by The Illogical Spoon. So we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.